All right. Well, welcome back once again to our discussions here that Pastor Vinny and I have been having. And I think on this one, I could be wrong, so I don't want to speculate, but I think we might be on a topic today that's kind of near and dear to Pastor Vinny's heart, and it's about vulnerability. And the way that came up and made me want to have this discussion with Pastor Vinny was I was reading an article by a psychology professor at a seminary, and his words struck me just because he said an important aspect of my counseling is to invite clients to risk trusting God by being wisely vulnerable with others in their lives. And I know I've benefited from that in my own life, and so just wanted to kind of chat with Pastor Vinny here for a few moments. Any you want to build on those thoughts at all? Why is vulnerability so important?
One of the things I think it does is that it facilitates a deeper connection or a friendship between people. If you look at marriage research, one of the things that they talk about is how we make bids for emotional connection. I think we do this
Right.
in and outside of marriage. Think of it, you're with a friend or something like that, and they look outside and they say something about a bird that's outside. Well, you have an
Right.
opportunity at that point to either stop what you're doing and look at them, talk to them, go over to the window and ask them what bird they're talking about. And all of a sudden, that small little conversation can turn into something where they tell you a story about their childhood when they were with their grandfather and how much he loved birds, and showed them how, what the birds were about and all that. And all of a sudden now there's this friendship that can deepen. Um, I have a friend who put himself out there many years ago in our relationship, and opened up a very uncomfortable conversation with me. At first, it was uncomfortable, and so he opened himself up to me in that conversation. And I had a decision point at that moment: am I going to open up to him, or am I going to talk to him about this conversation, or am I going to shut it down? And so that kind, I can see even in a friendship how vulnerability on his part really deepened our relationship. I'm thinking of a husband that tells his wife about something shameful from his past, and he's been with her for many years, and he's terrified of telling her this, and so he doesn't tell her for a long time, and then he finally tells her, and it turns out she's planning to leave him like that week. She's planning to separate with him, and all of a sudden now they start moving closer together because of his vulnerability to tell her something that he never told her before. And I think we can also see where a lack of vulnerability could get in the way of trust and growth. That same husband that kept that secret from his childhood, from his wife, could have had a trusting relationship. Um, he could not have had a really good trusting relationship with his wife up to that point, because he was holding back so much of who he
Right.
was in his childhood. Um, and I have a client that I met with for months and months and months, and they finally revealed something to me that would have been really important for us to know at the beginning of
Yeah.
treatment.
Right.
And so growth for that person was impossible because they weren't really telling me the truth of who they were and what they have experienced. And so I couldn't help them. So,
Right.
um, when you asked me about this, I also thought about how vulnerability impacts leadership. One of my first jobs was at a Fortune 500 company called McDonald's, and I was flipping burgers in the back there. And we had two different managers, one that would bark orders to us on how many, hamburgers she needed and how I didn't do the hamburgers correctly and all this kind of thing. And then there was another one who would basically, when she asked for something, she'd say, "Can you do me a favor?" And there was for that woman who asked, can I do a favor for you? I would clean the bathrooms, I'd clean the floors, and I'd do it with pride because she was asking me to help her. She needed help. She needed me, while this other person was rude and nasty. Um, and so I think as leaders, sometimes we think we need to be perfect, but I think the people that follow us in our organizations and our families, and they move toward us when we're vulnerable, when we share something of ourselves with them that we don't necessarily have to. And then I thought about, why aren't we more vulnerable? I think it's scary. Like that client, this one client called me after a session. They had told me something about themselves, and they thought they made a terrible mistake. So on their way home, they had to call me, and they were upset that they had let this out. They hadn't told this to anyone in a long time, that the secret was out now and this person was panicking. So I think it can be a really scary moment. I shared a sermon illustration a few weeks ago, and people could have thrown me under the bus for that sermon illustration and how I shared it and how I was vulnerable about what was going on with me in a particular moment of my life. But instead, after that, two men that I admire came up to me and they shared more of themselves with me because I shared something of myself in that particular sermon. So, but the time between telling the illustration and getting the responses from these men was scary because I didn't know how people would respond to that. And of course, the time leading up to sharing that illustration is also scary because I'm like, how are people going to respond to this? I don't know. And I'm interested to hear what you have to say, because I was thinking some biblical examples of vulnerability, like Paul, who says, when I'm weak, I am strong, and how Jesus strengthens us in our weaknesses. And I was thinking about Esther and how she was vulnerable before the king and how she was able to save her people. And then just thinking about the vulnerability of God the Father sending Jesus into this world, and Jesus coming in the body of an infant, and how he got close to lepers. As we've been looking through the book of Matthew, we see him getting close to people who other people would never get close to, making himself vulnerable. And then obviously placing himself in front of Judas, the high priests, and ultimately the cross.
Yeah. Yeah, those are some good examples there for sure. Yeah, I think ultimately, what I've heard as well in counseling classes is the same thing, that vulnerability creates intimacy. It creates those moments of intimacy because we're essentially letting someone else see us for who we are, and that's kind of how I wanted to conclude the discussion here. Was to simply say, I've mentioned this in my sermons, but it's just been a kind of a transformative thought for me. And of all things, it came from a counselor, Sharon Hirsch, and she mentions that what human beings basically want is to be known, loved, and accepted for who they are. Right?
Mm-hmm.
We want to be able to confess, here's who I really am. Here I am in all of my brokenness and shame,
Mm-hmm.
and will you still love me anyway? And as you just said, I totally agree. That can happen in a wise conversation with a friend. Maybe we let down our guard a bit and share, a story in our past that's shameful, and yet they don't reject us and they continue to want to be our friends. I appreciate the illustration in marriage as well, because there's a quote years back that kind of became a meme on Facebook, but it was so true. It was from Matt Chandler, and he said marriage is essentially one person saying to the other person, I've seen the ugly side of you and I'm staying.
Yeah.
And I think that's a helpful way. It's the same thing, and that's what it means. That's why it's so important in the context of love, is because we that is what we want, right? We want somebody to say, here's who I really am, and then the person says to us again, yeah, and I know all of that, and I still choose you. I still want to be with you. Now, here's how we can kind of bring this discussion to a close, is to say, I'm sure you and I would both agree that that's what you and I long for other people, for people watching this video, people in our church, is to be able to experience that in a relationship with somebody. And I think we can do that by God's grace. We can make it might be a long, arduous journey, but we can get there. But here's what I want to say, and this is what I have said in sermons as well, and that's that, even if you don't get to experience that at the relational level, you do get to experience it with God. Because we know that he knows us better than we know ourselves. He knows everything about us. He knows all of our deepest, darkest secrets. And he knows that, and he still says, and yet, I love you. And I think that's why you and I, in our past as well, I know that our pasts are different, but we're both men, and I know your background a little bit in trauma, and everybody has their own background, and I have mine as well. Being an achiever, as we said, and Enneagram 3, therefore, failure has been a big deal in my life. And so therefore, what I'm getting at is, we know that God sees us for who we are and says, I love you, and I choose you, and I sent my son to die for you, and therefore to bring you into relationship with myself. And that's where we're supposed to find our ultimate soul satisfaction. So that's what I hope in this discussion with vulnerability, that our people that are listening to this would find an outlet to have that vulnerable conversation with a friend and in church. But know that you have that in God as well. most importantly. So that's something that's been helpful for me to think about. Any other thoughts, Vinny?
Yeah, I
Before we
just want to
done?
say that every week on Wednesdays at this
Mm,
point, we're meeting a group where we're talking about the intersection of emotions and spirituality. Right now, we're talking about what to do with overwhelming emotions, and a good part of this is around vulnerability. So if people want to make a comment in the comments section, we can point them to that resource where we're doing a group every week on that online, and then we record part of it. So if you don't want to come on Wednesdays at 4, then we can make the videos available to you.
yeah, great. That's a good resource. And then for one other one would be to say the book I just mentioned, where I quoted from the counselor Sharon Hirsch, that comes from her book, The Last Addiction. So I definitely recommend that. So check out Pastor Vinny's class that he's teaching, and then maybe on. You may have heard of a small company by the name of Amazon. I hear that you can get books there. So that might be where they might check that out for the book by Sharon Hirsch. All right, guys. Well, thanks for tuning in again, and we'll see you soon.
Bye now.
All right, see you. Bye-bye.